Hello, I'm Steve Harris. I'm a Council Vice President in Michigan Crossroads Council. As part of our virtual camporee this weekend, I am going to bake an apple pie. I've baked this kind of apple pie dozens of times as part of the cooking demonstration I do as part of the Introduction for Outdoor Leadership Skills. To begin with, before I actually work with the food, I found it's best to wash my hands. And I've also found that it takes me 10 seconds to repeat the Scout Law. So if I repeat it slowly, twice, then I know I have spent enough time washing my hands. I'm now going to turn to actually preparing the apples. I always use two different kinds of apples when I bake a pie. I always use a Granny Smith and typically have about 4 Granny Smith apples. I then contrast the flavor and texture of the Granny Smith with some kind of red apple. A lot of times I use McIntosh, Gala, Pink Lady, whatever looks good in the supermarket. But I always have 2 different kinds of apples when I bake a pie. The first thing I do when I actually start to work with the apples is to remove the stem. Then I turn the apple upside down to cut it. This is the flattest surface, and so for safety reasons, I put the flattest surface on the cutting board. I then cut it in half, and I usually cut the apples into very small pieces when I bake a pie. So there's quarters, eighths, and I use 16ths when I bake a pie. So I cut each of them. Once I've got the apples sliced to the correct size, I then core them. And I'll just save the rest for later. We're back. I have cut, peeled, and cored the apples. The Granny Smiths, which are a little bit firmer apple, I cut into 16ths. The Galas, which aren't quite as firm, I cut into 8ths. So we now have 4 Granny Smith apples and 3 Gala apples that are cut and prepared. The next we'd like to do is prepare the dry ingredients. I'm putting into a container, I put 3/4 of a cup of sugar, a 1/4 teaspoon of salt, nutmeg, and cinnamon, and 1/8 of a teaspoon of allspice. Before I leave, I put all that into a container like this, and I do this at home, and I shake it up, and this is how I take the dry ingredients with me to camp. I put it in a container like this and I take it to camp. Once I'm in camp, and I've already prepared the apples, I take the dry ingredients and I add to them 3 tablespoons of lemon juice. I apologize, 1.5 tablespoons of lemon juice, 1.5. So that's 1 and 1.5. I mix them up, the dry with the lemon juice. And then I add that to the apples. And I mix this up to make sure that the apples are coated. And I set the mixture aside. while I prepare the crust. Now, because we're doing this in camp for our virtual camporee, I'm going to use a prepared crust. At home, I bake my own crust and prepare my own crust, but it's just easier when you're at a virtual camporee to use a prepared crust. We're going to need an entire packet because it has two crusts, one for the bottom and one for the top. Now, what I found is that the Pillsbury pie crusts are not quite large enough to fit into my pie pan. So what I do is I unroll them and I put just a touch of flour on the cutting board and then put the pie crust down and roll it out ever so slightly. In doing so, just in each direction, roll it just lightly in each direction. And what that does is it enlarges the crust just enough so it fits a little bit better into my pie pan. That's all I need. So I take that, put it onto my rolling pin, and place it into my pie pan. For the bottom crust, I make sure that it's pushed out to the sides and that there's a little bit of overlap because I'm going to need that overlap when I put the top crust on. The next step is to add the apples, and I found, give them one more stir, but I found that if I just pour the apples into the pie pan, that it damages the bottom of the crust. It puts holes and then you get leaks into the pie pan itself as the pie bakes. So what I do is I actually spoon the first layer or so of apples into the pan and then pour the rest in. And that prevents damage to the crust itself. Got an escapee. Well, looks like we've got the right amount of apples because you want it to be slightly mounded, like it is here. Now, what I do at this point is shake the pan a little bit to get the apples to settle in to the pan. Now I'm ready for the top crust. Again, I'm going to need to roll it out just a smidge so that it's the right size to completely cover the top of the pie. Just gentle roll in each direction, stretch it just a touch. And I found that it's best if when working with these prepared crusts, that you let it warm up to room temperature, because if it's just pulled out of the cooler, it's a little stiff and it's not as easy to work with compared to if you've let it warm up to room temperature. So again, put it onto the rolling pin, transfer it, and it now sits on the top of the pie. And you can see I've got some overlap. Now I go around and tuck this under around the entire pie. can see why you need just a little more so you have enough that you can tuck it under. There are a couple ways that I found that it's helpful to crimp the pie crust. And I'm going to show you 2 ways that I use. There are lots and lots of ways, but I'm going to show you 2 ways that I use. The first, you can take a fork. So I'll just do that, and you can see that you put, and what this does is it makes sure to seal the top to the bottom of the 2 crusts. And you can go around, and using a fork, you can crimp it together. The other way is that I use 2 fingers and my thumb, and you can see it. What I do is I pinch them together and move around and crimp the crust that way. There are lots of other ways. Those are 2 ways that I use. The next step is that I put an egg wash on the top of the crust, and I use the egg white. And I stir the white a little. And I spread the egg white on the top of the crust and cover the entire top of the crust. This gives it a nice brown look when the pie is baked. I then add a little bit of sugar that I sprinkle on the top. Just a nice little touch to add a little sugar on the top. Then you have to cut vents to let the steam out as the pie bakes. You can do whatever kind of design you want. Because my name is Steve, I always make sure to include some S's in the top. And then just some rays, just some little, but that way the steam can come out as the pie bakes. Now what I do is I bake the pie at 4 1/4 for 425 degrees for 25 minutes. Then I reduce the heat to 375 and cook it for another 30 to 35 minutes. When we're cooking out of doors, I use a Dutch oven. And I found that for the Dutch oven, that each briquette of charcoal is worth 25 degrees Fahrenheit. So you can do the math to get how many briquettes you need to get to 425 degrees. Then after a while you take some off and get it to 375. Each briquette lasts for about half an hour, or about 45 minutes to an hour, depending on how cold it is outdoors. But I use Kingsford charcoal, and each one of those briquettes is worth 25 degrees. So what I'm going to do is put this into the oven. I'll bake it for 425 for 25 minutes, reduce it, cook it for another half hour or so, and then we'll come back and show you the final product. Couple quick points as the pie finishes baking. First, I like to add the lemon juice because it adds brightness. Now my daughter, the chef, really rolls her eyes when I say that, but it really does, and she knows that. So keep in mind adding a little bit of lemon juice. Second, some Dutch oven tips. Put something on the bottom of the Dutch oven, like a small cooling rack, or even 3 or 4 rocks of the same size, and then put the pie pan on top of that so that the pan does not actually touch the bottom of the Dutch oven. If the bottom of the pie pan is touching the bottom of the Dutch oven, it will burn the bottom of the pie. So you have to elevate it up and allow air to flow underneath the pie pan. One other tip is that you should check your pie or anything you're baking or cooking in what I call half segments. So for example, if the recipe calls for it to bake for half an hour, check it in half that time, 15 minutes. Because if the oven happens to be too hot, it's still at 15 minutes, you probably haven't overcooked it, overbaked it, and ruined the item. So you can add more time to it if you need to, but if necessary, you can stop baking at 15 minutes. But if it's really hot and you don't check it until 30 minutes, you could overbake tremendously and ruin the pie. So those are some Dutch oven tips. I'm going to pull the pie out right now. You're going to have to let the pie cool for at least an hour before you can eat it. And I hope you enjoy the rest of your virtual camporee. For more information on scouting here in Michigan, go to www.michiganscouting.org. Enjoy.